Welcome to the Federalist Paper 45 class by the Grumpy Old Vet. This is lesson 17 in this series. This lesson will cover essay number 45 of 85 essays, all written to the people of the state of New York, in counter to the arguments of the anti-federalists, to convince the people of the 13 states to ratify the Constitution. This essay was written by Madison on the limited and defined powers of the federal government and their sphere of authority, and contrasted that to the sovereignty of the state and its sphere of control. With that, let's move out. Welcome to the class, Federalist Paper 45, brought to you by the Hillsdale Justice Project at Liberty Hall, narrated by John Rutan. The alleged danger from the powers of the Union to the state governments. The Federalist number 45, 26th of January 1788, written by Madison for the Independent Journal. And as all 85 Federalist papers start out, to the people of the state of New York, having shown that no one of the powers transferred to the federal government is unnecessary or improper. The next question to be considered is whether the whole mass of them will be dangerous to the portion of authority left in the several states. The adversaries to the plan of the convention, instead of considering in the first place what degree of power was absolutely necessary for the purposes of the federal government, have exhausted themselves in a secondary inquiry into the possible consequences of the proposed degree of power to the governments of the particular states. But if the Union, as has been shown, be essential to the security of the people of America against foreign danger, if it be essential to their security against contentions and wars among the different states, if it be essential to guard them against those violent and oppressive factions which embitter the blessings of liberty, and against those military establishments which must gradually poison its very fountain. If, in a word, the Union be essential to the happiness of the people of America, is it not preposterous to urge as an objection to a government, without which the objects of the Union cannot be attained, that such a government may derogate from the importance of the governments of the individual states? I've already shown that none of the powers given to the federal government are unnecessary or improper. The next question is whether the total amount of power given to the federal government is a threat to the authority that remains with the states. Opponents of the Constitution have focused more on how the federal government's powers might affect the states, rather than first asking how much power is actually necessary for the federal government to function properly. But if the Union is essential to protecting the American people from foreign threats, preventing conflicts between the states, guarding against dangerous factions that can corrupt liberty, and keeping military forces from becoming a threat to freedom, if, in short, the Union is necessary for the happiness of the American people, then isn't it absurd to argue against the very government needed to secure these goals just because it might reduce the influence of individual state governments? Was, then, the American Revolution effected? Was the American Confederacy formed? Was the precious blood of thousands spilt, and the hard-earned substance of millions lavished, not that the people of America should enjoy peace, liberty, and safety, but that the government of the individual states, that particular municipal establishments, might enjoy a certain extent of power and be arrayed with certain dignities and attributes of sovereignty? We have heard of the impious doctrine in the Old World that the people were made for kings, not kings for the people. Is the same doctrine to be revived in the New, in another shape, that the solid happiness of the people is to be sacrificed to the views of political institutions of a different form? It is too early for politicians to presume on our forgetting that the public good, the real welfare of the great body of the people, is the supreme object to be pursued, and that no form of government whatever has any other value than as it may be fitted for the attainment of this object. Were the plan of the convention adverse to the public happiness, my voice would be, reject the plan. Were the Union itself inconsistent with the public happiness, it would be, abolish the Union. In like manner, as far as the sovereignty of the states cannot be reconciled to the happiness of the people, the voice of every good citizen must be, let the former be sacrificed to the latter. How far the sacrifice is necessary has been shown. How far the unsacrificed residue will be endangered is the question before us. Several important considerations have been touched in the course of these papers, which discountenance the supposition that the operation of the federal government will by degrees prove fatal to the state governments. The more I revolve the subject, the more fully I am persuaded that the balance is much more likely to be disturbed by the preponderancy of the last than of the first scale. We have seen, in all the examples of ancient and modern confederacies, the strongest tendency continually betraying itself in the members to despoil the general government of its authorities, with a very ineffectual capacity in the latter to defend itself against the encroachments. Although, in most of these examples, the system has been so dissimilar from that under consideration as greatly to weaken any inference concerning the latter from the fate of the former. Yet, as the states will retain, under the proposed Constitution, a very extensive portion of active sovereignty, the inference ought not to be wholly disregarded. In the Achaean League, it is probable that the federal head had a degree and species of power, which gave it a considerable likeness to the government framed by the convention. Did we fight the American Revolution, form the Confederation, spill the blood of thousands, and spend the hard-earned wealth of millions, not so that the American people could have peace, liberty, and security, but simply so that state governments could hold power and enjoy certain titles and privileges? We've heard the corrupt idea in the old world that people exist to serve kings rather than kings existing to serve the people. Are we now to adopt the same idea in a new form, that the well-being of the people should be sacrificed for the sake of political institutions? It's far too soon for politicians to assume we have forgotten that the true purpose of government is to serve the public good and promote the well-being of the people. No system of government has any value except in how well it fulfills this purpose. If the Constitution proposed by the Convention worked against the happiness of the people, I would say, reject it. If the Union itself became harmful, I would say, abolish it. Likewise, if state sovereignty cannot be aligned with the well-being of the people, then every good citizen must say, the state's power must give way to the people's happiness. How much of this sacrifice is necessary has already been explained. The real question now is how much of the state's remaining authority is actually at risk. Throughout these papers, I have pointed to several important reasons to doubt the claim that the federal government will slowly destroy state governments. The more I examine the issue, the more convinced I am that, if anything, the real danger is the opposite, that the states will overpower the federal government. History has shown that in both ancient and modern confederacies, individual states tend to strip power from the central government, which often lacks the strength to resist. While those past confederacies were quite different from the system now being proposed, and any comparison must be made cautiously, it is still worth considering the historical pattern. Under the new Constitution, the states will retain a significant amount of active sovereignty, so the risk of states undermining federal authority should not be ignored. In fact, the Achaean League, a historical example of a confederation, had a central authority with a degree of power that in some ways resembled the government being proposed by the convention. The Lycian Confederacy, as far as its principles and form are transmitted, must have borne a still greater analogy to it. Yet history does not inform us that either of them ever degenerated, or tended to degenerate, into one consolidated government. On the contrary, we know that the ruin of one of them proceeded from the incapacity of the federal authority to prevent the dissensions, and finally the disunion of the subordinate authorities. These cases are the more worthy of our attention, as the external causes by which the component parts were pressed together were much more numerous and powerful than in our case, and consequently, less powerful ligaments within would be sufficient to bind the members to the head and to each other. In the feudal system, we have seen a similar propensity exemplified. Notwithstanding the want of proper sympathy in every instance between the local sovereigns and the people, and the sympathy, in some instances, between the general sovereign and the latter, it usually happened that the local sovereigns prevailed in the rivalship for encroachments. The Lycian Confederacy, based on what we know about its structure and principles, was even more similar to the system we are proposing. Yet history does not show that it, or the Achaean League, ever collapsed into a single, centralized government. Instead, we know that one of them fell apart because the federal authority was too weak to stop internal conflicts, which eventually led to its complete disunion. These examples are especially important to consider because the external forces that originally held those confederacies together were much stronger than what we face today. This means that they needed less internal unity to remain stable, yet they still struggled to stay intact. We see a similar pattern in the feudal system. Even though local rulers often had little connection with their people, and in some cases the central authority was more in tune with them, the local rulers almost always succeeded in taking more power at the expense of the central government. Had no external dangers enforced internal harmony and subordination, and particularly had the local sovereigns possessed the affections of the people, the great kingdoms in Europe would at this time consist of as many independent princes as there were formerly feudatory barons. The state government will have the advantage of the federal government, whether we compare them in respect to the immediate dependence of the one on the other, to the weight of personal influence which each side will possess, to the powers respectively vested in them, to the predilection and probable support of the people, to the disposition and faculty of resisting and frustrating the measures of each other. The state governments may be regarded as constituent and essential parts of the federal government, whilst the latter is nowise essential to the operation or organization of the former. Without the intervention of the state legislatures, the President of the United States cannot be elected at all. They must in all cases have a great share in his appointment and will perhaps in most cases of themselves determine it. If external threats had not forced European kingdoms to maintain internal unity and obedience, and especially if local rulers had gained the loyalty of the people, Europe today would likely be divided into as many independent states as there were once feudal barons. State governments will always have an advantage over the federal government when we compare them in key areas: their level of direct control over one another, the personal influence of their leaders, the powers granted to them, the loyalty and support of the people, and their ability to resist or block each other's actions. State governments are fundamental parts of the federal system, whereas the federal government is not necessary for state governments to function. For example, without the involvement of state legislatures, the President of the United States cannot even be elected. In every case, the states play a significant role in choosing the president, and in many instances, they may ultimately decide the outcome themselves. The Senate will be elected absolutely and exclusively by the state legislatures. Even the House of Representatives, though drawn immediately from the people, will be chosen very much under the influence of that class of men whose influence over the people obtains for themselves an election into the state legislatures. Thus, each of the principal branches of the federal government will owe its existence more or less to the favor of the state governments, and must consequently feel a dependence, which is much more likely to beget a disposition too obsequious than too overbearing towards them. On the other side, the component parts of the state governments will in no instance be indebted for their appointment to the direct agency of the federal government, and very little, if at all, to the local influence of its members. The number of individuals employed under the Constitution of the United States will be much smaller than the number employed under the particular states. The Senate will be chosen entirely by state legislatures. Even though the House of Representatives is elected directly by the people, those elections will still be heavily influenced by the same political figures who gain influence by being elected to state legislatures. Because of this, the key branches of the federal government will, in one way or another, owe their positions to the state governments. This means they are more likely to be overly submissive to the states rather than too powerful over them. On the other hand, state governments do not depend on the federal government for their officials to be chosen, nor do they rely much, if at all, on the influence of federal officials. Additionally, the number of people working under the U.S. Constitution will be far smaller than the number employed by individual state governments. There will consequently be less of personal influence on the side of the former than of the latter. The members of the legislative, executive, and judiciary departments of 13 and more states, the justices of peace, officers of militia, ministerial officers of justice, with all the county, corporation, and town officers, for 3 millions and more of people, intermixed, and having particular acquaintance with every class and circle of people, must exceed, beyond all proportion, both in number and influence, those of every description who will be employed in the administration of the federal system. Compare the members of the 3 great departments of the 13 states, excluding from the Judiciary Department the justices of peace, with the members of the corresponding departments of the single government of the Union. Compare the militia officers of 3 millions of people with the military and marine officers of any establishment which is within the compass of probability, or, I may add, of possibility, and in this view alone, we may pronounce the advantage of the states to be decisive. If the federal government is to have collectors of revenue, the state governments will have theirs also, and as those of the former will be principally on the seacoast and not very numerous, whilst those of the latter will be spread over the face of the country and will be very numerous, the advantage in this view also lies on the same side. This means that individuals working for the federal government will have far less personal influence than those serving in state governments. Across the 13 and future states, there will be countless officials, including legislators, governors, judges, justices of the peace, militia officers, law enforcement officials, and local government officers in counties, towns, and cities. These people live among the population, have personal connections with all social groups, and will vastly outnumber and wield far more influence than the relatively small number of officials working under the federal system. If we compare the number of people in the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of the 13 states, excluding local justices of the peace, with those in the same branches of the federal government, the states clearly have the advantage. If we compare the number of state militia officers serving a population of 3 million with the number of military and naval officers the federal government could realistically maintain, the states again hold a clear advantage. Even when it comes to tax collection, the states will remain dominant. While the federal government will have tax collectors, they will be relatively few in number and mostly located along the seacoast. Meanwhile, state tax collectors will be numerous and spread throughout the entire country, further strengthening the influence of state governments over the federal government. It is true that the Confederacy is to possess and may exercise the power of collecting internal as well as external taxes throughout the states, but it is probable that this power will not be resorted to except for supplemental purposes of revenue. That an option will then be given to the states to supply their quotas by previous collections of their own, and that the eventual collection, under the immediate authority of the Union, will generally be made by the officers and according to the rules appointed by the several states. Indeed, it is extremely probable that in other instances, particularly in the organization of the judicial power, the officers of the states will be clothed with the correspondent authority of the Union. Should it happen, however, that separate collectors of internal revenue should be appointed under the federal government, the influence of the whole number would not bear a comparison with that of the multitude of state officers in the opposite scale. The federal government will have the power to collect both internal and external taxes across the states. However, it is likely that this power will only be used as a backup source of revenue. In most cases, the states will probably be given the option to collect their share of taxes first, and if necessary, any remaining amounts will be collected by federal authorities. Even then, tax collection will likely be carried out by state-appointed officials following state procedures. Similarly, in other areas, such as the judicial system, it is very likely that state officials will be given authority to act on behalf of the federal government when needed. However, even if the federal government does create its own separate group of tax collectors, their influence will be insignificant compared to the vast number of state officials who perform similar duties at the local level. Within every district to which a federal collector would be allotted, there would not be less than 30 or 40, or even more, officers of different descriptions, and many of them persons of character and weight, whose influence would lie on the side of the state. The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The former will be exercised principally on external objects, as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce, with which last the power of taxation will, for the most part, be connected. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects which, in the ordinary course of affairs, concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people, and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. The operations of the federal government will be most extensive and important in times of war and danger, those of the state governments in times of peace and security. As the former periods will probably bear a small proportion to the latter, the state governments will here enjoy another advantage over the federal government. The more adequate, indeed, the federal powers may be rendered to the national defense, the less frequent will be those scenes of danger which might favor their ascendancy over the governments of the particular states. In every district where a federal tax collector operates, there will be at least 30 or 40 other state and local officials, many of them respected and influential, who will naturally support state authority. Under the proposed Constitution, the federal government's powers are few and clearly defined, while the powers left to the states are broad and flexible. The federal government will primarily handle external matters like war, peace, diplomacy, and foreign trade, with taxation mostly tied to these areas. Meanwhile, state governments will oversee nearly everything that affects people's daily lives, including their rights, property, public safety, and economic development. The federal government's role will be most significant in times of war or crisis, while state governments will be more active during times of peace and stability. Since peacetime will likely be far more common than war, state governments will hold more influence overall. In fact, the stronger the federal government is in protecting the nation, the less often war or emergencies will arise, further reducing its chances of overpowering state authority. If the new Constitution be examined with accuracy and candor, it will be found that the change which it proposes consists much less in the addition of new powers to the Union than in the invigoration of its original powers. The regulation of commerce, it is true, is a new power, but that seems to be an addition which few oppose, and from which no apprehensions are entertained. The powers relating to war and peace, armies and fleets, treaties and finance, with the other more considerable powers, are all vested in the existing Congress by the Articles of Confederation. The proposed change does not enlarge these powers, it only substitutes a more effectual mode of administering them. The change relating to taxation may be regarded as the most important, and yet the present Congress have as complete authority to require of the states indefinite supplies of money for the common defense and general welfare, as the future Congress will have to require them of individual citizens, and the latter will be no more bound than the states themselves have been to pay the quotas respectively taxed on them. If we carefully examine the new Constitution, we'll see that the proposed changes don't add a lot of new powers to the federal government. Instead, they strengthen the powers that already exist. For example, regulating commerce is a new power, but it's something most people support, and there's no real concern about it. The powers over war and peace, armies, fleets, treaties, and finances are already given to Congress under the Articles of Confederation. The proposed Constitution doesn't give Congress more power in these areas. It just provides a more effective way to manage them. The change regarding taxation is probably the most significant. However, under the current system, Congress already has the authority to demand money from the states for national defense and general welfare. The new system doesn't give the federal government any more authority to require money from individuals than Congress already has to demand it from the states. And just like the states weren't always required to pay their share, Individuals won't be bound any more than the states have been. Had the states complied punctually with the Articles of Confederation, or could their compliance have been enforced by as peaceable means as may be used with success towards single persons, our past experience is very far from countenancing an opinion that the state governments would have lost their constitutional powers and have gradually undergone an entire consolidation. To maintain that such an event would have ensued would be to say at once that the existence of the state governments is incompatible with any system whatever that accomplishes the essential purposes of the Union. Publius. If the states had followed the Articles of Confederation more consistently, or if it had been possible to enforce compliance in a peaceful way as we might with individuals, our past experience doesn't support the idea that the state governments would have lost their powers and eventually become part of one unified government. To claim that this would have happened is to argue that state governments cannot coexist with any system that successfully achieves the main goals of the Union. Publius. Summary. Federalist Paper. 45, written by James Madison, presents the following key principles. 1. Limited powers of the federal government. The powers granted to the federal government by the Constitution are few and defined, primarily focused on external matters like defense, foreign relations, and commerce. The majority of powers remain with the states and local governments, which will handle most matters related to people's daily lives. 2. State sovereignty. The states retain significant authority, with powers related to public safety, welfare, and the regulation of internal matters. The federal government's role is not intended to overpower state governments, but to complement them. 3. Federal government's role in national defense. While the federal government has the power to maintain a military and engage in foreign diplomacy, it will primarily act in times of national danger or war, which will likely be rare. During peacetime, state governments will play a larger role. 4. No risk of federal overreach. The Constitution does not establish a central government with unchecked power. The federal government is designed to be a supplement to the states, not a replacement. Madison argues that the fear of federal overreach is misplaced because the power of the federal government is deliberately limited. In essence, the paper reassures that the states will retain a dominant role, and the federal government's powers are carefully structured to avoid encroaching on the sovereignty of the states. This concludes the 17th class in this series on Federalist Paper 45. I hope you found the information helpful and entertaining. I will see you in Class 18 where we will cover Federalist Paper 49. Fall out.